I would say it's a intermediate level setup, but I really want to touch up on the very end of the chat on some very useful tools and some techniques that I use almost every day in production. So first of all, before I begin, for every single shot or every single effect that I'm going to create, I try to gather as much reference as possible. In this case, the scenario was like a sandy place, and the explosions, rather than being like very fiery, very gassy things, they were more like dust and powder explosions. In the case of the biker sequence, we received a few plates. Some of them had practical explosions, which were very useful as a reference. So from many, we got still frames. In some of the shots, there were actual practical explosions that we used to just mimic the look of the explosion. So I think this one on the left, I really like. These two examples I gathered for this class, they were not specifically for the shots, but you can see here a lot of detail, especially the one on the left. You can see debris flying around, dust trailing from the debris. You can even see 2 or 3 different colors. Usually, the dust has at least 2 colors, one from the surface and one from deep below. Sometimes you get like darker, more humid sand. Sometimes you get even whiter sand that derives from rocks. So it's very useful to plan this level of detail ahead of the shot and of the actual setup. For example, I would use a different emitter for the dust than I would use for the powder. And even I could separate a third emitter for the underlying dust. Here we cannot see, but if you check an animated reference, you would see that usually dust tends to fall due to the weight of the grains, and powder usually and smoke tends to rise because of the heat. So those two things are also very important. So I think I won't switch. I have a few videos reference, but I don't think it's necessary to switch. We can check the still images. The one on the right has a slight fire to it and even sparks. A few of the practical explosions on the show had this element, which I found important, just to give like the extra realism. You could only perceive them in a few frames, 2, maybe 3 frames, but yet we took those details into account to make them more realistic and to tie much better with practical elements. So it's very important to take note of all these details. Usually I have a notebook around my desk and take note of the small details. So in this case, I would break the effect into the debris, the very noticeable large chunks, then the sand that's trailing behind the debris, and a few more elements would add, for example, the small granular flying dust. I would generate a third element, and you will see that on the setup. I'm using that on the setup, plus the emitters for the fluid simulations. So that's basically regarding the reference. Sometimes you can finish with at least 20, 30 different reference images or videos. So another very important aspect of planning is usually whenever I create or recreate an effect, I think in real life elements. One of the most important is the scale. Usually I try to model everything to a real life scale, not only because of the dynamics. Usually dynamics look much better when doing them at real scales, but also the lighting implications. Usually in larger pipelines, your lighting department will render with physically based lighting. And in this case, scale is also very important. So you will usually light with an HDR, or if not, at least you will use physically based lighting that is very scale dependent. So this is very important. Sometimes, especially with some water and fluid effects, we can simulate at larger scales, but then bring back the caches to a real life unit. Same with camera. Sometimes you don't get the entire information of the camera. Sometimes you do. If you do, that's very lucky, and you would try to mimic that in the CG camera, especially the placement, of course, how the camera is moving, focal length, the shutter angle is super important to get a realistic motion blur. I think motion blur is one of those small things that sometimes gets overlooked and is absolutely crucial for a photographic look and to match with a live action plate. And I usually always have a geometric reference. I always have a human scale on my object library. It's probably the first thing I bring in every time I'm going to generate almost any kind of effect, just because it makes it easier to determine the scale, and it's the first thing that one recognizes. The human scale is very, very common. Okay, so in terms of the system, there's usually three things that I always try to do, especially if you're working as a TD and you're going to hand off any kind of system to other artists. It's very, very important that the effects artists are able to understand and to use the system as easily as possible. So in this case, simplicity is a key. So as we can think of, sometimes less is more in this case, and I always try to be very clear with my groupings. For example, the values that I expose to the artist, usually I try to be very, very simple. So another thing is you want the system to be flexible. For example, you may have a very particular shot with a very particular look, say the explosions that we received for the biker sequence, but you never know if you will in the future receive another sequence, or maybe the director decides to change the look of the explosion. So that is, you want to be very flexible. And I think that's one of the greatest advantages of thinking particles is the procedural nature of the tool really makes you change even after something is already started. You can very easily change an emitter, the scale of something, the particle types. So whenever you can, keep it as procedural and flexible. And scalable, well, it has a little bit to do with what I mentioned before. You never know when something is going to change. So say you're working on the trail. In our case, we didn't want like a fiery, chaotic look, but you never know. Maybe down the line you receive a different specification and you need to add fire or, I don't know, more turbulence. So think of this kind of details and try to make the system as scalable as possible. And well, this I'll come back later, but in the end, again, thinking real life, the more accurately you can mimic the forces in the real life, and in this case, the plate that you receive, the better the effect will look. And although for these effects, we used a lot of simulations, pyro simulations, fluid simulations, the bulk of the work is done with a particle system. So think that your simulations in the end can only be as good as your emitters. So try to invest much time on the particle emitters so the simulation process is not only faster, but more realistic. I've struggled a lot with trying to generate realistic simulations, especially fire, smoke, water. And in the end, I go back to the emitter, refine the particle system, and that is what will give the simulation the correct velocities, the correct friction, and that will make a better and much realistic simulation. So I don't really think I will have the time to go through the simulations. I have a FumeFX setup that works with a thinking particle system that I may share, or I may touch just briefly at the end of the chat if I have time. But the main focus of the class will be focused on the emitter. So most of the work will be done with the thinking particle system. So at the very end, I will talk about a few of my favorite nodes. Some of them I think are kind of hidden or probably misused, but this I'll go with later. So right now I'm going to dive into 3 Studio Max. So please, if you have any questions before I go into the technical stuff, go ahead. If not, I will switch the screen to the Max interface. And we'll begin with technical stuff. The setup for a basic trail is usually pretty straightforward. Here I created a path. It's a helix actually. As you could see on the welcome screen, the director decided to go with a spirally motion. This initial part, we created several iterations of the missile paths. At first, we started with a very linear path, and as we went on, both the VFX supervisor and director made some iterations on how the path of the missile should be, the trajectory, actually. And in the end, they went for this spirally motion, which was very dynamic. And this is why I decided to go with a helix. Just a note here, as I mentioned, thinking particles, the system, as it's usually a procedural system, it's very, very flexible, and it will give way to very easy changes. With the Max tools, you have all these parametric tools. Whenever you can, try to use all these parametric tools, because it's very easy to go with fast changes. For example, in this case, I'm just applying a bend to slightly change the trajectory, or keep a helix live. I could probably change the number of turns very easily, the radius. Sometimes it's not always possible to go with these parametric modifiers, and you have to use probably editable spline or stuff, but just try to be as flexible as possible, just to go around iterations as fast as possible. So here I'm only attaching the geometry to the path. It's a simple path follow attachment. And another important thing with the geometry, the actual missile, is that I created the pivot point is on the exhaust, on the rocket exhaust. So this way I'm going to use the pivot point later on with the thinkingParticle system to generate the particles from the pivot point. It doesn't have to necessarily be the geometry. You can use a normal here. It doesn't really matter that much. I'm using the geometry here just give me a precise idea of the scale of the wall, the exhaust. Basically, it'll give me a better visual representation of how things are moving, you know. So I'm going to create the thinkingParticles from scratch. Let me move this window that's in the way. Okay. So remember, it doesn't really matter where you place the thinkingParticles icon. I usually place it in front of the camera just to make sure to select it easily. And I'm going to open the property window. And I'm going to switch from the camera view to the perspective view, just to have a better view of both the properties and what's happening here on the viewport. So as I mentioned earlier, try to be as simple as possible and as ordered as you can. Usually, if some artist is going to take over your work later on the process, which is not strange, you want him to understand the system as clearly as possible. So usually I start with my groups. I will create one for the actual missile. And just to be clearer for the class, I will separate the missile from the impact, and then I can share both of the files. But you can also work in a single file and have both of the system working on the same file. There's no problem there. And I will create a subgroup for the trail. Again, thinking on the scalability of the system, maybe after I need to generate the fire, and I would create another group for the fire. I mean, it's not the case in this shot, but I mean, try to think ahead. It's very, very common that as you go, things may change in production. So for the dynamic systems, I usually create an overall system. This, for example, if you later decide to cache the whole system in a single file, this would help. And then I'm going to create another dynamic set for the actual. And first of all, I'm going to create a generator, a position born. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use the actual geometry of the rocket to emit the particles. So I'm going to create a helper, a node. And I'm going to pick the actual missile geometry. And just connect the position. So now we have particles emitting from the rocket. And again, since I'm emitting from the pivot point, I know that the exact spot where the particle I'm emitting is going to work for me. So that's fine. So here I forgot to create a group. I usually create a born group. Again, everything has to do with the order. Try to be as orderly as you can. So I'll have to reconnect here. Position. Okay, so now we have our rocket emitting. And first of all, I don't need the smoke to be emitted the entire shot. So let's create a time interval condition, just to make sure we're only emitting the first few frames. When to connect it here to the COM. So after frame 40, we shouldn't be emitting smoke anymore. After the impact, we don't want to emit any more particles. So first of all, I'm going to check lifespan of the particles. Again, as the particles will only be there for the smoke simulation, I don't need them to live that long. So I'm going to lower the lifespan to 20. These are frames. And the variation to, let's say, 50% or so. So remember, almost every single parameter that you use, try to use a certain variation. This will make the effect more organic and more natural. So I usually add up a variation in almost every single parameter I'm using. So for the speed, I don't need right now any speed. So I'll bring that back to 0. So I'm going to rely more on the forces rather than the originating speed from the particle. Now for the impact, I will do the opposite. But in this case, I will cancel the speed in the position born. I may add just a little bit of speed for them to fan out. For example, I don't know, probably 20 units. And the direction, I'll increase the variation. So they can fan out a bit. So if you see, even this is too much, but in the end, it all depends on the look you're after. So I'm going to increase the number of particles. I usually like to use particles per second rather than total count. I'll increase this to even 2,000. Another very important thing to keep in mind is you want to keep iterating as fast as possible. So what I usually do is start with a very low particle count, and towards the end of the shot, before the simulation, I will increase the particle count and even the sub-steps. So one quick comment, if you go to your master dynamic, you will notice here to the right, the subsampling. So it's usually defaulted to 1 sample per frame. For very fast-moving objects, this will be insufficient. Sometimes you need to increase the substep. So right now I'm using half of the frame to sample. So just to check the difference. So notice how the stepping here is very clear. This rocket is moving very, very fast. So the default per frame sample it won't be enough. So right now I'm going to use half of the frame. In the end, I may use a higher value. So you can also switch to samples per second and add your own value. For example, 120 would be, this scene is running at 30 frames per second. So 120 would be 4 samples per frame, which for this kind of shot is not unusual. But for now, I'm just going to work with half of the frame. So going back to the born parameters, just make sure that they're not fanning too much. So I'm going to decrease the speed to 10. Okay, so this is basically the birth. So the rest is going to rely on the forces, and this is what I was talking about before. Try to mimic as much realistically as possible the forces of nature. So for example, in this shot we had a very, very noticeable wind drawing the particles or the smoke to the right. So that is one of the forces that I will mimic. Another is friction. I almost every single time use some kind of friction or drag. So it's not natural for an object to continue moving and never stop. So in this case, with the smoke, friction or drag is very, very noticeable. So I would try to mimic that too. If you have any kind of turbulence, of course. And okay, let me just demonstrate here in a practical manner. So aside from my born group, I'm going to create one for the forces. So I want the forces to operate on the trail group, of course. So one thing I forgot, again, I'm not very good with multitasking, so I may forget some steps along the way. I forgot to send the born particles to the trail group. So I'm going to change the color of the trail group. I'll try to make it so you guys can see the colors on the viewport. So please, if you cannot see the particles or if the colors are not permitting you to see correctly, let me know and I can change them. So I'm going to send the born particles to the trail group. And the trail, I'm going to use, again, an orange color, a bright orange. And I rather see just dots than clicks. And I'm going to change in the master dynamic. I don't want to force the ticks to show. So one important thing when using very heavy simulations and particle systems, remember, try turning on edit on the fly so the system doesn't try to update in real time. As we increase the number of particles, this may start getting very heavy. So I would rather start with edit on the fly off so I can see the changes real time. But as I progress with more and more particles, I may turn this off. So just be mindful of this. And okay, now we can see the orange color. I hope you guys can see the particles. let me change to, I'm not sure of the resolution.
And David, I have one more things to add on the settings.
Yes.
You also should, or I suggest to our users, always turn off the real-time playback option in 3D Studio Max with particle simulations.
Correct.
Because
Correct.
if it starts jumping, so if the calculations take longer and longer, and the real-time tries to get these 25 or whatever frames per second you have there. So then it jumps to the next frame, and then thinkingParticles has to calculate all frames in between, and it starts to get really choppy and crazy. So I always suggest turn off real time, and the more particles, the more simulation you have, the better it will be without the real time setting. Okay,
correct.
Sorry to jump in. It just came to my mind. You explained all the other stuff really well, and this is also one thing every user should make sure to turn off the real time for particle simulations.
Yeah, in general, I think we'll go. This is not a super complex simulation for now, but in the end, I used probably over 100,000 particles for the emission, so it started to slow down. Also, as we progress, I will show you a few techniques that I use. There are several methods that we use, and of course I will demonstrate that further. But for now, just be mindful that even though it looks like a simple setup, I ended up with a huge amount of particles and also a very high subsampling value. So, okay, back to the forces. Of course, we want to operate on the trail group. I'm going to create a force. I'm going to make it operate on the particles. So one very important thing that I usually like to do, and this is a common practice, whenever you add a force, you will have a direction. It's usually a vector. So for that, you can use a 0.3 helper. It's not mandatory, but it's recommended. So with a 0.3 helper, you can assign a direction or a vector that controls the direction. For example, in the shot, the wind was blowing to the right. So that would be the positive X value. If you're not sure, you can look here on your lower left corner of the viewport. So in this case, I would use a positive X value. Say, for example, that you're mimicking gravity. Usually, I also use a force for the gravity. You would use a negative Z value. So right now, the 0.3 helper is taking over the direction. So right now, we can use only the strength to control how much the wind is blowing. So I'll increase slightly. Again, I don't want the wind to be like overwhelming, but in this specific shot, it was very noticeable. So going back to the drag force, remember that friction, the air friction or drag is super important with especially smoke and small particles. But again, even with the big chunks of debris, I used a certain amount of friction. So let me go into the operators. Dynamic, and plug the friction in. So I want to go relatively high with friction. Again, the air friction is a drag. So I want to go very high with the drag just to make this just to make the sense of very light smoke that will react very soon to the air. Cool. Now, there's something that I really liked. One of the new tools that came in with the drop 6 that permits me to use or to create a very nice turbulence. Usually the workflow was to generate several wind forces, wind space warps, which are fine. The thing that I usually had with those kind of space warps is that it's very difficult to control. At least I had a very difficult time to control them. But now with drop 6, we have this new helper called text map. So it's in the standard. So this is one of those new nodes that I really love. Usually how it works is you will connect the particle to the position. So the text map will make a lookup of the position of the particle, and from that will derive the force. You need to combine this with a force operator. So what you need to do is plug the turbulence into the direction. And of course, you need to plug the particle here. So let me just increase the force. To make it more apparent. So here you go. Since, remember, I turned off edit on the fly, this will be very useful to watch in real time your forces here. So the text map has its own parameters for the size of the turbulence and the amount of turbulence or intensity. Right now, just to demonstrate, I'm going to increase the size. And perhaps one other thing I'm going to do is increase the particle count and the substeps, just to make more obvious the effect. So this is exactly what I was talking about. It's very easy to go with a high number of substeps. Of course, this will increase the simulation time, but still right now with this amount of particles, the simulation time is very fast, it's almost real time. So going back to the Born, I'm going to increase, let's say to twice the amount. Well, now we'll be able to see the text map in action. So first of all, I usually try to play with the scale. So for this system, I used two different scales. One a very high frequency and another a low frequency turbulence. Now this is very exaggerated, but I really like the wavy feel. This was very difficult to manage with the wind space warp. It was very difficult to predict the scale, the intensity, and the actual shape. So another very important thing that the text map node has is you can shift the noise in any given axis. For example, if you are happy with the overall shape, but probably you want to shift a bit one of these curves or even animate them, you can do so with a X, Y, and Z shift. So I'm going to increase the intensity a bit just to make this a little more obvious. And another parameter that I didn't use, but you can, it's very useful if you're doing some smoke effects or even organic effect is the frequency. I'm going to increase the frequency, say to 20 units. And you'll notice the turbulence will start to pulse a little bit. I have a better example. I will show a little bit later to demonstrate this. So I'll just move on. So this is the basic setup for the trail. As I mentioned, for the final shot, I used an additional text map to give a little bit of breakup with more turbulence, a smaller turbulence. But I think I'm going to leave this now to go with the impact. And again, for the fume simulation, what I did, this is one of the things with very high speed objects and very long distances. In the end, for the simulation, I used 3 fume effects grids. This way, I optimized the voxel count and was able to get a very fine resolution for my render. So I think I can share that also with the replay. And yeah, that's basically it for the trail. I don't know if you have any questions before I go to the impact example. If not, I will have this final version of the shot plus the original, the initial file only with the geometry, so you can replicate the exercise at home if you want. So let me open another instance of 3D Studio Max. Then I will go ahead with the explosion setup. This is explosion step 0. So I'm going to save this one as is, just so everybody has only the geometry. And again, as I mentioned with the initial presentation, here is my human scale. So don't worry, I won't blow him up. It's just for me to have a very clear understanding of the scale in the shot. So I'm positioning the human scale exactly where the impact will be. That way I can easily judge the height of the cloud or the speed of the debris flying out. So I usually tend to leave this guy hanging around, and it's very useful. So I will hide the trail. I won't need the trail anymore. Just a quick explanation of how I created this. This is a simple Boolean. I just placed a sphere with some noise over the box here, and I intersected it with the sphere with the box and created this. I call it the chunks object. This will be the emitter for the particles. Actually, I will be instancing the actual chunk, and I will break it and give it some velocities, and you will see. So just wanted to show this before I start. And yeah, I want to start from scratch. That way you guys see the whole process. So again, I'm going to place my thinkingParticles icon here wherever I can select it easily. And I'm going to open the properties window. And again, I'm going to try to be as ordered as possible. So I will create 3 groups. One will be for the chunks. Again, remember the example, the reference I was showing. So one element will be the chunks, which is the high velocity debris flying around. From this, we'll have small rocks trailing back. So small rocks. And the rocks will be emitting some dust. And I think that's basically it. Regarding the master dynamic, I will create a system. Again, the purpose of this system hierarchy is if I later want to cache the entire system, I can do that in one single file. It's probably not the best way to go, but sometimes it's necessary. For example, what I would usually do is cache the chunks. Oops, sorry. Then on a separate file, I would cache the rocks. And on a third file, I would cache the sand particulates. So let's call this dynamic set rock. And this one will be sand. So just one comment: if your entire pipeline is within 3D Studio Max, you would typically cache your particle systems here within your TP system. If your pipeline requires to go out of 3D Studio Max, say you're rendering in Maya or whatever other software, you can also export as Alembic. The TP Alembic Export is a very, very useful tool. So you have several options. For this system, I will demonstrate the Alembic cache just because it's not like that common. Usually, it's more common to cache here, and most of you guys have done it. But I will assume that probably I will send this to a lighting department that uses some other software. Okay, so within my groups, I usually generate subgroups, and this, every single artist I know has their different approach, but in the end, my logic will be, I will generate a born group, at least for the chunks, and then I will create a group for all the dynamics happening with the chunks. For example, the shape collisions, gravity forces, whatever happens after they're born. So let me create two more groups. One will be born or birth. The other will be dynamic. And the system, the same way I will create a born, and actually just for reference, I will call this born to object to particle, because I'm going to use an object to particle operator to instance the chunks geometry. So first things first, let me add an object to particle operator, and I'm going to pick the chunks objects. For you to know, you can press the H key as after clicking on the pick object, just to open the selection list. I think that the way is easier. So I'm going to select the chunks object and make an object to particle. I need to create a particle that thinkingParticles can break and can simulate. So for that, I'm going to instance the shape. So I also need the volume of the shape. I don't want only a single point for the particle. I also want the entire shape to be instanced. So let me hide the actual geometry. And right now, if I scrub on the timeline, you will see this is the actual thinkingParticle system that's replicating that geometry. So that's exactly what I need. So I'm going to send this particle to the born group. That's very important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate a volume breaker. Usually I separate both sets. So this one I'm going to call VB for volume break. So the volume break, I only want to be turned on the very first frame. So this is another tip I found out the hard way. I usually start simulations after frame 0. I usually start the simulation on frame 1. Say you have a very complex fracture or thousands of particles. You don't want your system to crash on frame 0 because that's very difficult to fix. So at least if you have frame 0 working, you're on the safe side. So I'm going to use a condition, and I'm going to use a time interval just to make sure that the volume break is being generated on frame 1. So of course I want to operate on the born group. So one tip, you can drag the group here from the list directly to the interface. And I'm going to use a time interval and of course a volume breaker. I'm going to connect the born group to the volume breaker, and I'm going to expose the on switch, connect it to the time interval, and make sure I start on frame 1. Okay, so one important thing, usually with volume breaker, the active segments or the active chunks is defaulted to 0. So just sure, in this case, we want them all active the very first frame. So I'm going to set this to 100%. There's a small gotcha. If you forget to activate them, you might not get the expected result. And what I usually set up very first is the raster size. This will define the size of the chunks. So the smaller the raster size is, the smaller chunks you will have with a volume breaker. So there you can see the Voronoi cells. They're quite large. So for this exercise, I think I used 3%. Not really sure, but maybe for the class I will use less chunks just to make the simulation faster. And I'm going to check under my master dynamics if I have edit on the fly on. I probably want to turn this on just for the chunks, and later I will turn it back off. So let me change the perspective. I think in terms of the volume breaker, that's basically it. Now I'm going to create the forces. Here are the chunks. And one small tip, I usually generate the initial velocity apart from the forces, because usually I only want the velocity when the particle is born. That way it won't interfere with gravity, wind, whatever. So again, I usually only activate the velocity when the particle is born. So the forces will be separate from the velocity, from the initial velocity. Just checking the parameters I used. So for this specific exercise, I had a fast-moving debris, so I was using 1400 centimeters. Remember I mentioned the scale? Usually when I'm working with 3D Studio Max, I'm working on centimeters. What I found is centimeters give me the most like optimal defaults, and it's also much predictable. So in this case, for the velocity, I used 1400 as the speed centimeters. So in this case, I'm going to operate on the born group. And I'm going to use my particle age condition to activate. So make sure to check the born. Also use when the particle enters the group, but just to be safe, I'm going to use born in this case. So I'm going to plug the velocity to the group. I'm going to expose the on and plug that to my condition. You have to make sure to plug also your condition to the particle group. And again, by default, you can use only the velocity node, but I like to use a 0.3 helper just to define the vector. It's not mandatory. Let me show you here if I was using 1400. And I'm going to use the variation just to spread out the chunks. Let's use a very high angle, say 45 degrees. Okay, so now we have an initial velocity going on. So just making sure the particles are in the born group. The volume breaker is operating one, and the velocity as well. Okay, so as well as the velocity, I'm going to add some spin, some initial spin. So right now I'm going to also add a spin into the system. So I'm going to connect the particle and the on. And remember, this has a little bit to do with the question. Right now, I'm only asking both the velocity and the spin to be applied in the initial frame. After that, the forces will take over. So I don't need the velocity to be constant throughout the entire shot, nor the spin. For example, the moment the chunks start interacting with the floor and with each other, the spin may change. So in this case, I only want to set both of these forces in the initial frame, in the born frame, and then the rest of the forces would take over. So regarding the spin, the time per second, the smaller you make this number, the faster the spin will be. So let me see. So we have the particle spinning. And here I'm going back to the vector 3 helper. Right now, I'm not really sure the direction they're taking. So here we have the speed and the variation. So the variation is making the chunks fan out. So let me turn off the forces. So right now, they're only flying upwards, but we need them to come back with the gravity. So for the setup, again, I just created a force with a downward vector. Again, Z is pointing upward, but the force is negative. So I'm using a negative 981 centimeters per second just to emulate gravity and have them fall down again. And again, I'm using a friction. Even though these guys are like very heavy, it will make them stop when they start hitting the ground. They just won't go continue rolling. They will eventually come to a stop. And finally, I used the shape collisions to make the chunks interact with the floor. So let me unhide the floor. Just so you guys can see it. So here we have the interaction now with the floor. So basically the setup is I created a shape collision. And with a node helper, I'm pointing to the terrain object. So I skipped forward a little bit here. But in the end, the only thing I'm trying to be mindful of is how the chunks will interact with the terrain. So something very important here, if you go to the chunks explosion group, yeah, that's what I forgot with a volume breaker. I never send it to the group, I believe. So we need to change the group with a volume breaker. I send them to a new group, and that group is the one that has the dynamics. So back to the shape collision, it's very important that you check under your group settings. To the right, you will see the shape collision dynamics. And then you will have the friction parameters. So I think by default, I'm not sure, but I remember that by default, the elasticity is kind of high. So the chunks will bounce around a lot. So I lowered the elasticity to make them a little heavier and not so rubbery looking. And I decreased the friction, I believe. So one of the things I really, really like of the shape collision that I haven't seen with any other simulations is like this cohesive effect. If you can see the chunks, they're not completely dislodged between each other. They kind of tend to adhere to one another, and that gives a very organic look. Sometimes it defaults to a very strong value, so you can decrease the friction. I believe it defaults to 100. That makes them look too blocky. They look almost as a single piece that's just flexing, which I like. I really like the look. But for an explosion, you probably don't want that much friction. Say that you're bringing down a wall or a ceiling, you might want to increase the friction. For the explosion, I lowered it so the rocks could take their separate ways. And also when they start interacting with the ground, they will start breaking apart, which looks very realistic. So I think that's the only thing I did with shape collision as far as I remember. And finally, I created the export, the Alembic Export node. And this is just as an example. I'm not using it really within the 3D Studio Max pipeline. But again, if you're taking this out to Maya, to Houdini, Katana, whatever, you may want to export an Alembic file. So again, this one is very powerful. You can export the geometry or just the particle system, velocities, the spin, etc., all the forces. So this will be the basic rigid body simulation, and from that we will derive the rest of the particles. So the rocks and the sand are pretty straightforward. The only thing I'm doing is emitting them from the rising debris chunks. And I'm probably running out of time, but I'm going to go very quick for the setup. For the rock setup, I created geometry because these are not so far away and they're not traveling that fast. So you can see a little bit of the detail. And I'm going to unhide all the geometry I created. It's not much. The motion blur comes with the velocity. So just make sure to export your velocities. Let me show you. Which are on by default. So just make sure you're checking your velocity on, and that will give the renderer the enough information to render the motion blur. Actually, I rendered this out with the Alembic. So I wanted just to use, as an example, the Alembic workflow, and I rendered the frames with the Alembic cache. So I'll show you real quick. You can see here on the left on my layers, I have a render layer, which is using the Alembic caches. Basically, what I did is I cached the Alembic, and what I rendered was the Alembic cache, not the actual thinkingParticles cache. So let me try to switch to the Nuke interface so you can take a look at the render passes. Yeah, right now I'm opening the properties windows.
Thank you.
I'm going to hide my render layer, and I'm going to recreate the export for the, let's say, for the chunks. So let me delete it all together and do it real time so you guys see how it was done. Create a new dynamic set. I will call it export. And the only thing you need to do is append an Alembic node. So it's under export, Alembic export. And there's two important things that you need to do. First of all, select the group that you want to export. In this case, it's the chunks explosion. So I'm selecting it here on the right and clicking on Add. So here, these will be the eligible particles to be exported. Another very important thing is you want to export your geometry, not only the particles themselves. And I believe by default, you're exporting only the particles. So under the export mode, make sure object per material or object per group is on. So this is very important. This is like a very important gotcha. If you don't turn this on, when you export to Maya or Houdini or Katana, you will only see points. You won't see the actual geometry. And once that's on, I usually check all the options on. By default, they're all on. Velocity is the most important, but you also want the spin, the age, the lifespan. For example, maybe at render time, you want the age to control a shader or something. So just make sure everything is on, unless you have like very little disk space, but usually you're better off turning everything on, and then you click on the export button. So here I'm going to catch it to this. I'm going to call it test cache. And let it run for a few seconds. It's very fast. And within 3D Studio Max, you only need to create an Alembic object. Okay, once the Alembic export is done, you will read it in with any external package that you will be rendering on. So I'm going to open real quick the renders, so you can see them on here on Nuke. And again, what I'm doing emphasis is that the render was generated from the Alembic. So here is the render, the actual render with the Alembic file. So you'll notice the motion blur there. So hopefully you're seeing the play blast.
Yes, perfect.
And notice how the motion blur is very well defined. I mean, usually you want motion blur for your moving particles. There's no real camera that won't perceive the motion blur. So that's super important, especially for the composite, for your final composite stage. So the rocks and the dust were both emitted from the moving debris. Pretty straightforward there. I just want to show you real quickly the geometry I used. I'm going to go back to Max now. So hopefully now you're seeing the Max interface.
Yes, we see it.
Perfect. So here's my thinking particle system. And oh yeah, I was talking about the rocks geometry that I generated. So it's very simple. I think I just created a geosphere. Then I added a little bit of noise and I scaled it down. But this is very important just to give the realism, the extra realism when things are flying out and the motion blur is acting. You will see like these tiny spikes and the noise and the different geometry. So what I did here for the rocks, here under the born, I created a geometry instance and I instanced all 3 geometries. So by default, if the geometry instance node is looking at 3 different objects, it will cycle between them. So no need to do any fancy stuff. You will have 3 variations of the rocks and no need to worry about anything else. So again, I'm adding a spin to the initial velocity. Only on a few first frames are the rocks being emitted from the debris. So right now, I think I'm out of time. I want to show super quickly a few of my favorite nodes. I will share the file with you guys, and you can check the setup here if you have any questions. I would have liked to go through the entire system, but the rest is what you have already seen. You've already seen I added forces. I added the shape collision and the export Alembic node. So if you guys have any questions or any comments before I go through the notes, just to finalize, let me go back to the presentation. I'm sharing the Photoshop presentation. So thinkingParticles is very robust, and it has an amount of nodes, helpers, etc. And sometimes it takes a while to get acquainted with all of the tools, but with the experience and from probably other peers or tutors, you gather like your favorite tools. And I just want to mention like a few hidden gems that I found that I usually apply on almost every single setup I use, and that I haven't seen applied in other setups as much as they could be. So first of all, there's a value to value node, which I use a lot to resample values. For example, let me open a file here. I'm going to switch again to 3D Studio Max real quick. Let me go over the three of them before I demonstrate, just so I'm not switching back and forth. Another one is the expression node, which has multiple purposes, but basically I use it a lot to create conditional logic with if statements. And the text map node, which I already demonstrated with a turbulent wind, with a smoke trail. So that's a new node, and it's very powerful. I think I waited a long time for that node first. So I'm going to switch to 3D Studio Max again. And here I have a very simple setup. So don't worry, it's going to take me like a few minutes. But it's very important tool. So I'm just birthing particles. It's actually a single particle that's rising to the sky. It's a small cube. Nothing fancy there. So hope you guys are seeing the cube.
Yes, we see that, all fine.
Perfect. So the only thing I'm doing here is sending the particle through the main group to a scale node. And if you see, the cube will decrease in scale, and then it will increase back to its original scale. So a very typical workflow would be to scale down a particle with the age. For example, as the particle is dying, it will become more and more, it will become smaller. So here I'm using the value to value to make it go small and then to increase the size back. So what I'm doing is I'm grabbing the lifespan of the particle, which I believe is 100. So if you check the lifespan, it's 100 frames. And then I'm dividing, if you check the multiply node, it's on to divide. I'm dividing the age by the lifespan. And that will give me a normalized number between 0 and 1. So for those who don't know this, you can right-click a parameter and check write to debug log, and it will turn blue. So if I go to the master dynamic, I can turn the debug log window. And if I press play, you will notice how this value goes from 0 to 1. So it will be 0 in frame 0 and the value of 1 in frame 100. So I have this normalized value, and then I can use that value to control the scale of the particle with a ramp. So the very important tool that we have here is this ramp. So remember, the normalized value goes from 0 to 1. That would be my minimum value and my maximum value. And I'm going to scale that value to go from 1, the original size, to 0. So if I had a linear ramp here, let me delete mine. I have a linear ramp. The cube will scale from 1 to 0, so it will disappear. But the great thing about this ramp is I can add a few points and change and remap those values however I see fit. So this node I really, really love. And yeah, finally, just to finish, let me open another example. I'll share also these two files. And the other one is the expression node, which is a multi-purpose node, very, very powerful. I really like it. And the main purpose for me is gives you the chance to add some conditional logic to your scene. For example, what I'm doing here, again, is a very simple example. I'm birthing particles with very high speeds. Actually, some of them are very fast. Some of them are relatively slow. Hopefully you can see the particles there. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a dynamic set. I just called it sort. And what I'm doing here is I'm sending the group to another group. So I have two groups, the cyan, which is the original group where they are born, and the yellow group. So what I'm doing with the expression is I'm feeding this if expression that is evaluating the speed of the particles. If the speed is over 150, it will send the particle into another group, the yellow one. So hopefully you're seeing these yellow dots that are moving faster. So this is just an example, but you can sort the particle by size, by proximity. I mean, this gives you a lot of possibilities. Makes it very, very powerful node. So just to go through the expression, it's an if. The first value is the condition. So in this case, the speed needs to be over 150. Then the second value, 1, is if the expression evaluates to positive, and the third value if the expression evaluates to negative, or in this case 0, and this turns on this node. So if I have a positive, this group will be on. If it's negative or 0, it will be off. So I hope it was clear. Basically, the only thing you need to know previously is to create a variable with an input. So in this case, I created an input called speed, and that's this variable here. And that's basically it. So hopefully you guys liked the information and it's useful. of course, I can answer a few questions. I think I went way over the time, but I can gladly answer a few questions. And if not, again, I can go through them within the Facebook group or the email.
Okay,
Okay.
quick one. Anyone with questions should make it quick now because I think David has to leave soon.
I guess they have everything. Okay, good.
Cool.
David, from my side, thank you very much for this webinar and spending your time here. It's really nice to see our users, and especially the best is anyway when users show other users how they work. There's always things to learn, and I can see in the chat there the audience watching you, they're all happy and enjoyed it as well. So once again, thank you very much, David.
Thank you very much, Edwin and Cedar, for the invitation again. Didn't have the chance to say hello to my peers and colleagues. I see some of my friends are here. Thank you for coming. Really glad to see you guys here. Again, I cannot see the whole screen, so
Yes.
Hi to everyone. Hi to everyone there, and hope to see you guys in the forums and